In the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson is yet again at odds with the EU over his intention to legislate new terrorism laws that it's hoped would keep terrorists in jail following a number of deaths as two terrorists paroled early almost immediately committed new acts of terror upon release. It's a move that could see Britain breach the European Convention on Human Rights, but isn't this precisely why Brexit was such a seismic issue? Mr. Spectator magazine and host of Outsiders, Rowan Dean, joins me now.
Hi,
so,
Peter.
Rowan, what am I missing here on Johnson's new terror laws? Because this seems like a hell of a lot of common sense to me, and in fact mirrors very much what happens in Australia.
Yeah, well, it is common sense, and what is absolutely not common sense is what Labor brought about, or laws that were brought about which were pushed very heavily from the left in Britain. And this was this idea that you would release prisoners early, you know, that special laws came in saying, OK, they only have to serve half their term. And it was this bizarre kind of bill that came about, and it was triggered at a point which allowed quite a few, or suspected, jihadists to basically walk away halfway through their sentence. And we saw a terror attack before Christmas with one of these characters, and we've just had one on this week where a guy was let out. Apparently, Peter, he was regarded by the Scotland Yard as the third most serious terrorist in Britain. And yet he was allowed to rock out, wander around, and a couple of days later he's off with his... He wanders into a store, grabs a knife, unwraps the knife in the store and goes out. And, I mean, I shouldn't... You know, it's not a funny thing, but it's just so absurd that he's out there stabbing people, and he's one of the most wanted or most suspicious terrorists in Britain. So these laws were just insane, and Boris Johnson, rightly prior to the election, was saying, I'm going to change these laws because they just, you know, talk about touchy-feely legislation gone berserk, that's, OK, you get your sentence, which is mostly not that long anyway, and then we're going to automatically let you out halfway through. So he's going to change that, but of course, you know, the lovies are up in arms saying, oh, no, 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 this is really important because no doubt this or that jihadist had a terrible upbringing or was bullied as a child or something or other. And look, this is left-wing madness that has infected Europe, has infected Britain. Thank goodness Johnson has a majority that he can now A, change these laws, but B, more importantly, having quit the European Union, say, which is the whole point of Brexit, as you said, Peter, we will decide our own laws and we will decide the laws for this country. It's a fascinating thing, Peter, that David Cameron, when he was first entered Downing Street as the Prime Minister, to his absolute astonishment, and this is really what triggered the whole Brexit thing, he found that 50% of his job was signing in laws that were created in Britain and not created by his own government. And that was his job. Sign away, sign away.
This is absolutely right. Yeah. This was the biggest issue, I think. It wasn't just so much you know, trade and other issues of determination, economic determination. I think the immigration, the unfettered immigration, Britain not feeling like Britain anymore, and you know, Londoners have a different view. They see themselves as a global city. But you get out to Birmingham, you get out to Brixton, you get outside in the satellite cities, I say, of London, the ones around the edges, the perimeters, where people are living a very different life than they do in Mayfair. I think this was where so much of the working class vote came from Brexit. And this, to me, is common sense, but the adoption, particularly of these, not just human rights laws, these activist identity laws and all these other things. I mean, Britain wrote the book on decency and the common law and Magna Carta, habeas corpus, I could go on. It's the very foundation of the law we all hold dear, but it's been bastardised by this relationship with the European courts, and I think that's a big task for Johnson, but I think that's where people will really see a difference. And I have to say, and I said this in my intro, Scott Morrison, you've got to start getting results, because the reason Boris is there is he promised results and he started to deliver, and the reason why Trump's there, he promised results and he has delivered. And Scott Morrison is far better than the alternative, but people will, you know, tot up the ledger, and he's got to get runs on the board and get them on the board quickly. I want to go to the issue of climate change, because Dominic Raab, he's the Secretary of the Environment, and he was out there this week with Maurice Payne in Australia. He had some comments I think he might be actually Foreign Minister, correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, there was a question in relation to climate change from the usual suspects at the BBC. I think I've got the grab there. I want to play people because it was arrogant in the extreme. Let's have a listen.
I think we have a question from the BBC.
It's actually on climate change. It's for Secretary Robb. You said that Britain is going to play a very important role in that global issue of climate change. And the UK is hosting a big summit on climate change later this year. What do you think of Australia's record on climate change, given that it is a very politically contentious issue here in context of the fires? Will a change in Australia's climate policies be one of the conditions in reaching an agreement? Question for Senator Payne, if you will. You're currently in negotiations with the EU as well to reach a free trade agreement. What is your priority, reaching an agreement with the EU or the UK? Do you want to see how the UK is going to resolve agreements with the EU before you finalise your agreement?
Okay, Ron, that question was all about, are you colonial power, former colonial power Britain, going to be able to beat recalcitrant Australia around the head on climate change? And he gave that question a level of, honest appraisal, if I can say that. And basically, in as much as he danced around, it certainly gave Australia and Scott Morrison a bit of a whack. What's with this?
Yeah, well, it's disgusting to quote a young Swedish lass. How dare you? How dare you, Britain or the EU lecture us on climate, on emissions, on renewables? Let's not forget, both Britain and particularly France, but all of Europe rely on nuclear power and have done for a long time. Nuclear is a key renewable that we don't hear any of the so-called renewables advocates in this country ever mention. It's pretty easy to meet your emissions when a large chunk of them comes from nuclear, which alone has literally zero emissions, rivals, if you like, wind and solar, with the key difference being that it's actually reliable and can deliver you energy and electricity in vast quantities whenever you want it. So any criticism of Australia that doesn't say in the same breath, we would support Australia going nuclear. That is the only way these people have any credibility if they are to lecture us. And for the likes of the Brits, who, as I say, and the French, it's the same thing. To reach their emissions targets is pretty easy compared to us, because we're dragged into all these other things because we're a mining nation and so on. So it's not a level playing field, and you constantly find us being lectured by the Europeans when, to his credit, and Scott Morrison, you mentioned getting runs on the board, Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor are actually, although personally I disagree with it, they are actually meeting the terms and the agreements that we signed up to, unlike virtually every other country, certainly every other major industrial country like China, India, etc. in the world. We're actually doing our bit, and the rest of the world, we're a soft target. They're penalising us, and to the eternal shame of the left, including our former Liberal Prime Minister in this country, running around the world criticising Australia for not doing enough is shameful.
I'll get to that former Prime Minister in just a moment, but people at home need to just do one thing for me. Over the weekend, Google emissions trading scheme and the EU, because you'll see a litany of rorts investigated by no less than the United Nations, who had to fess up how badly this was handled. The involvement of Middle Eastern crime gangs, Eastern European crime gangs, all of the graft and corruption that came with the early adoption of an emissions trading scheme and carbon credits, which is why the Abbott government and now the Morrison government has been so opposed to Australia trading in international credits, because nobody knows if the promised emissions reduction on things like a solar farm in Morocco is ever actually going to happen. I mean, it's all rubbish. But Malcolm Turnbull, we started talking about terrorists. Malcolm Turnbull, I mean, he likened, and he calls them climate change deniers inside the Liberal Party, as terrorists. Now, nobody else in politics, or indeed a former Prime Minister, would get away calling their former colleagues, current colleagues now, terrorists. What's all that about?
Yeah, well, first thing, when are the Liberal Party going to boot this character out? I mean, he's just laughing in their face now, making a mockery of his time in office. You know, it's very simple, either Malcolm Turnbull was correct only a couple of years ago when during bushfires while he was Prime Minister, he came out and declared, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, climate change has nothing to do with droughts or bushfires. As I said, I'm paraphrasing. 2 years later, suddenly, oh, it's all changed, despite us only having 1.2 or 1.3% of global emissions. And let's not forget that the entire greenhouse theory is supposed to be the entire cumulative effect of all the world's carbon emissions over a century or so that you get your slight increase in temperature, 1.5 or 2 degrees. So to suggest that in the 2 years since he was Prime Minister, the whole thing has changed, that Australia has suddenly dried out and become ridiculously hot and flammable and a tinderbox, which it wasn't 2 years ago, is a laughable proposition. So he was either lying then or he's lying now, or he was wrong then and is wrong now, or he was being deceptive then or deceptive now. Take your pick.
Tells the truth. Malcolm Turnbull always tells the truth.
But he can't be both. One or the other is right or wrong.